Hey, so happy to have you tuning into Module 2. I'm really excited to introduce you to the 4 quadrants of life in this very first lesson. Life becomes a lot simpler and begins to make a lot more sense once you're aware of these 4 quadrants. And the conversation we're going to have in this lesson about these 4 quadrants is going to answer the question, what's the real problem behind all your excuses? Let's dive in.
Okay. Well, let's just start by recapping a little bit. Module 1, first thing I really wanted to get across is you're not the problem. So tools are helpful, knowledge is helpful, but those things do not equal transformation, they support transformation. And so if you have the knowledge you think you need and the tools you think you need and you're not transforming, that doesn't mean you're the issue. It's just the fact that we needed to have a different conversation about what transformation actually is. And so then we talked about the fact that transformation is possible, which is fabulous, and the vast differences between growth and fixed mindset. And then, of course, we ended here, talking about what I'm calling the language of life, how discomforts show up as a way to get our attention about something that's out of balance. And we have the opportunity to, instead of continuing this vicious cycle, of doing an actual 180 from imbalance to balance. Okay? So we ended at this point where we labeled, or we put excuses under the column of conversation starter. And we realized that willpower, although can provide temporary relief, it's not an actual solution, and the excuses aren't the actual problem. So should we talk about the actual problem? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to introduce you to what I'm calling the 4 quadrants of life. And these 4 quadrants came to me on a coaching call, and I don't remember what the topic was of conversation, but it had to be at least a year ago, maybe 2 years ago that this happened. And from there, I continued just to kind of engage with it. I knew it was kind of a powerful thing, but I didn't really know what it wanted to be or what it was trying to get across. And as different clients had things come up, I would usually bring this quadrant up and engage with it more. And then as I was creating this course, I knew the intention for the course. I knew that I wanted to bring people through the transformation that I've gone through in the last 10 to 12 years, but in a much quicker fashion than I went through. And so I knew I had to get clear about what the transformation actually was that happened to me. And so, as some of you know, I literally printed up every piece of content I've ever written. I reflected on tons of my clients and coaching sessions, and I kept looking for themes. And I kept putting things into themes, and I reworked those themes about 3 times until I realized that the quadrant I'm going to introduce you to was a huge part of summarizing this powerful journey that I've been on in a way that you could get the insights a lot quicker than I did, if that makes sense. So, and then from there, obviously, that was maybe 2 or 3 months ago as I've been developing the details of the course. It's just kind of had a life of its own. It keeps talking to me, for lack of a better way to say it. And so I hope that you'll internalize it the way you need to and let it talk to you the way it needs to talk to you, because it's not a tip, it's not a list of like motivation tactics. It's just it's quadrants. Okay? So with that being said, I'll introduce you here. So of course, with quadrants, we've got a y-axis and an x-axis. Our x-axis is our action axis. And on this side, we have disengaged. And on the other side, we have engaged. The y-axis is the perspective axis. At the bottom, we have bondage. And at the top, we have freedom. So, action's currency, the forms that action can take, are time and money. And the form that perspective can take, perspective's currency, is attention. You might call it focus as well. And you're going to see here the words we use are less important than the meaning behind them. So as I start to label these quadrants, I'm going to tell you how, there's a lot of different ways to label it. So if you need a different word to describe it, that's fine. But here's the essence. We have perspective axis. The currency of perspective is attention. We have the action axis. The currency of action is time and money. Freedom and bondage, disengaged and engaged. So with bondage, because it's the perspective axis, you're seeing, how I would define this is you're seeing something, your world, in any particular moment through the lens of no choice. So basically, you've decided that someone else or something else or your past self has already made a choice for you, and you don't have a choice in the matter. Okay? It's also feeling like things are bigger than you. It's feeling overwhelmed by. It's feeling shackled to. It's feeling pushed around by. Freedom, on the other hand, is the perspective of choice. It's feeling bigger than, not in a way that you're pushing anything else around, but just that nothing is pushing you around. It's feeling in charge, would be another way to describe it. So life gets a lot simpler, and I mean a lot simpler, when you realize that you yourself personally, and pretty much, I shouldn't say pretty much, any human on the face of the earth hates to feel any degree of disengagement with what's important in life. And humans also hate to feel any degree of bondage. Okay? So put another way, life gets a lot simpler when we realize we want to be here. We want to feel free and engaged with things that are important. I think one of my absolute favorite quotes puts it perfectly. Tal Ben-Shahar says, "Attaining lasting happiness requires that you enjoy the journey on a way towards a destination you deem valuable. Happiness, therefore, is not about making it to the peak of the mountain, nor is it about climbing aimlessly around the mountain. Happiness is the experience of climbing toward the peak." I'm going to say that one more time. Happiness is the experience of climbing toward the peak. So Tal Ben-Shahar used to be a Harvard psychology professor. He now is an author and speaker around the world. And I think not only does his concept work for happiness, but I think you could easily add in health. So health and happiness are the experience of climbing toward the peak. So if we take his quote and we think about it in terms of these four quadrants, freedom, of course, would be choosing your peak. Bondage would be your peak has already been chosen by someone else, by outward circumstances, by your past self. And then engagement, of course, would be walking, and disengagement, not walking. So the experience of climbing towards the peak really lands in our free and engaged quadrant. And this quadrant is one I'm titling Inspired. Of course, you can title it whatever feels right, but I like Inspired for myself. The engaged and in bondage quadrant, I originally titled Exhausted. But did any of you watch Oprah's speech at the Golden Globes? Yeah? Okay. So I was listening to that, and she was talking about, I mean, she said a lot of really cool things, but she was talking about how she reframed her words, and she said something about even though she was like on this path of passion and stuff, and she was super busy, she was never exhausted. But then she said, well, there were times I was exhausted, but I was never depleted. And I kind of like that distinction because I think there are times where you might feel physically exhausted in this quadrant, but there's a difference between physical exhaustion and depletion. So by exhaustion here, I mean depletion. So I'm going to title it that. So this is my exhausted depletion or depleted quadrant. Over here, disengaged and freedom, free and disengaged, I could say. I originally titled this one Unmotivated. And I still like that. However, a few weeks ago, I was on a coaching call with a client, and we were talking about this quadrant, and she said, I like the term unconscious for this quadrant. And I really like that too. So I'm going to add unconscious. And the disengaged and in bondage quadrant, I often call intimidated. So the unmotivated unconscious quadrant kind of becomes, I would call it the quadrant of protest. Anything you want to say about that? The intimidated quadrant becomes the quadrant of withdrawal or hiding. Exhausted or depleted quadrant is the quadrant of pushing. And the inspired quadrant is the quadrant of pull. The quadrant of sustainability. The quadrant of inspired to and inspired by. So there's a few things I want to point out about this quadrant. First and foremost, I think it's really important to recognize that our culture values the depleted quadrant. This is what we praise. This is what we trust. This is what we are, if you're living by cultural standards, you're living by this standard primarily, okay? We praise this quadrant, but what I really want you to realize is that although as a whole, collectively, we're praising this quadrant, no individual can sustain themselves here. It's impossible. You cannot. This is the only sustainable quadrant. This quadrant, obviously, if you're feeling exhausted and depleted, either emotionally or physically, you can't continue that. So what happens is what I'm calling the vicious 180. Because did you know that triangles make 180 degrees if you add up all the, I know. I used to really like math. I still do. So the vicious 180 looks like this. You hang out in the exhausted quadrant because that's what you're supposed to do. Our culture values it, so on and so forth. But you can't sustain it. So typically what happens is we go right up here. This could be called the forget it quadrant too. It's a quadrant of protest, okay? So if we put this in terms of health and fitness, a lot of times you're doing a diet, you've done it for 21 days, and then for whatever reason, you feel great physically, by the way, okay? But for whatever reason, you say forget it. You go up here, you're going to protest. You feel some freedom, right? But you're suddenly disengaging with food in your body. Now, we typically stay here sometimes for seconds, sometimes for weeks, until bondage pulls us down. And as we're going to talk about in that quadrant, bondage often pulls us down using the word should. So you had some freedom, you had some choice, and then you're not comfortable staying here, so you come down to here. And then because you're not taking action, and our culture values action, values this quadrant, usually we stay here until we feel guilty or anxious enough until we get pulled over here. Okay, let's try a different one. Thank you. So this is our V180, vicious 180. And it can last a lifetime if you want it to, or not if you want it to, if you're unconscious about it, okay? Now, obviously, we have a different choice. But if we don't know we have that choice, then we'll keep playing out different versions of this over and over. And once again, I can't emphasize this enough. That's because our culture values this, but nobody can stay there. So our health industry values this, but no one, even in the health industry, is staying there. So if you see someone who maybe they're exercising every day and eating really right, if it's not coming from this place, then I promise you other aspects of their life are doing this. Because every individual will do this if they're hanging out here too much. So again, you're not crazy if you see this in yourself. This is natural. It's the only thing that keeps you sane. It's almost like out of self-preservation, really. Okay? So let me tell you my story. I used to be obsessed with exercise. I would exercise every single day unless I was sick, and a lot of times if I was sick. I would spend at least an hour doing intense stuff. A lot of times more than that. I might teach a Pilates class, teach a stability ball class, and then go on the elliptical for an hour. It was intense. And what would happen, so obviously exercise was here for me. And what would happen is, because I can't sustain that, what I would often do is go here when it came to food. So I didn't really cook much. I ate a lot of convenience foods. I would binge all the time on chocolate chips and peanut butter. And so I would say, forget it until, but I really shouldn't be doing that, And I would quickly, the next day, move over here to exhausted, okay? So I was exercising every day. I was healthy, you guys. I was really healthy. But I was playing this out in a really extreme way. I had a very dysfunctional relationship with food and exercise and my body. It was not healthy. But to the outside, it was healthy, okay? And that's because our culture values this, okay? So it was praising me for having a completely dysfunctional relationship with my body and with exercise. My culture was praising me, so it took me a while to get off this V180, which is what I'm trying to help you do sooner, because I didn't know this is what was happening. I thought I was doing things right. So I say all this, and actually another one I see play out a ton that I feel like is important to mention is, as a culture, we spend a ton of time here with work, and then with health, out of self-preservation, we go here. Okay? So we're workaholics, but then we need somewhere to, like a respite, and we can't sustain that sort of exhaustion and engagement with bondage, so health just gets thrown by the wayside. Does that make sense? Okay. So this is all leading me to, back to here. And that is, what is the imbalance? What is the problem that our excuses are trying to have a conversation with us about? And if you see this, I think it all boils down to the fact that we aren't spending enough time here. So every excuse is trying to get our attention about the fact that we're doing some form of this vicious dance. Would you agree? Okay. So let's label that, and we're just going to say every excuse is trying to start a conversation about the fact that you're not feeling inspired. So take a breath on that. Okay, so I'd love to hear your thoughts. Anybody willing to share?
I'll start with this. Did it resonate?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Did anything in particular stand out in regards to what's happening in your life?
I think for me, I definitely had the exhausted, depleted work, which led me to be unmotivated about everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you're right, it's like, I get up, I get dressed, I go to work.
Mm-hmm.
I come home, I go to bed.
Mm-hmm.
Rinse, repeat.
I know.
So, it was
You're
all-
not alone.
So when I'm exhausted and depleted, I don't hear things. I literally don't hear things that people are saying to me.
Yeah.
And I've caught myself before asking someone the same questions, same exact question 3 or 4 times, like in a 30-minute period. And it's, you don't know you're doing it until somebody points out that you're doing it. And then you think, what am I doing? Why am I feeling this way? Why am I here?
Because you don't have the resources.
Right.
Yeah.
It's definitely unconscious for a while, and then it takes me to intimidated.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to withdraw and hide because I feel bad about it.
I know. The good news is all of this is natural, considering that we think we're supposed to be in depleted. So all the weird things you think you do aren't that weird. They're just your forms of coping with something that's dysfunctional. Anything else anyone wants to share? Or ask?
Well, I was thinking, how do you break this cycle? And maybe like we're getting to that, but I realized that most of my exercise and meal planning practices, like they're all around the anxiety of gaining weight. And then I did gain weight the last couple of years, like 30 pounds.
And
I
that
know.
anxiety adds on to the weight. And it raises your blood pressure.
Becomes a
And
yeah,
it
even
becomes
more
a vicious cycle. It's tough. It speaks to that whole concept of like being a fibro. They say one of the best things for fibro is exercise because it helps you feel better. It's like, okay, I feel like crap, so to help myself not feel like crap, I'm going to exercise, which will probably hurt, to help me not feel like crap. And it's like, or I'm going to eat better so that I don't feel like crap. And then you feel like, great, now I don't have my comfort food and I feel like crap. So it's hard because it's like, well, the more you exercise, the easier it'll be and the better you'll feel. But you have to get there. You have to get into it. And that's hard.
Well, I think you bring up such a great point, and it's when we start with dysfunction, all that comes from it is vicious cycles.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And so that's what I hope you're seeing here is we have to start with function. We have to identify dysfunction because the only thing that grows out of dysfunction is more dysfunction.
Yes.
Ready to move on or anything else?
How to get out of that.
Oh.
You'll get us there. Right? Is that coming up?
Nope, this is about staying stuck, guys. Well, there you go. Now you know what most people don't know, and that is that your excuses are simply conversation starters about the V180s you're doing in your life. Put another way, They're conversation starters about not feeling free and engaged, about not feeling inspired. In the next lesson, we're going to take a look at the excuses that arise when people are asked about exercise in particular. To dive in, head over to Module 2, Lesson 2.